Well, welcome everyone. My name is Derek Choi. I'm the president of the Crimson this year, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of all of us. Yeah, I'm glad you all made it, given the weather. I know some of you are from warmer climates, so thank you for making the trek north. Speaking for both myself and other people at the Crimson, we look forward to Georgia's every year as an opportunity to meet other college journalists and see what you all are doing, and of course also hear from Nieman Fellows and others about their sort of thoughts on journalism. And for us, it's always just a fantastic opportunity to see outside the bubble of Harvard that we sometimes find ourselves ensconced in. Tonight, however, I have the great honor of introducing Maggie Haberman, who, as hopefully all of you know, is the New York Times White House correspondent. She's been reporting on the Trump administration's first few months in office. And before that, she was reporting on the transition and the election, the campaign, of course. And prior to being at the New York Times, she was at Politico for about half a decade, and before that at the New York Post and the New York Daily News. I think suffice it to say she knows more about Donald Trump than pretty much anyone else, certainly here, but very possibly any journalist. As some of you may know, fields calls from him, as she did last week, and routinely breaks stories that shape the news cycle. You may have seen yesterday she broke a story about the House investigation into potential Russian interference in the election. So stories that are obviously very relevant to the national discourse and, like I said, shape how people think about the news. And in fact, we're, of course, lucky to have her, and I'm sure she could be writing a story right now as well. So I'm glad she can. Well, I'm glad she could be here anyway. And of course, some of you may have seen also that she got 141 million page views last year by herself, which is a pretty impressive number, especially from sort of my neck of the woods, because that is almost 10 Harvard Crimsons put together in a single person. So obviously an incredibly impressive number. I'm sure, I'm sure many of you agree, there are a few better people to kind of speak to us, both given the national climate and just given the name that she has made for herself in journalism. So I know her talk will be fascinating and timely, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you for having me. I have known Gigi and the Georges family for a very long time, so it is a huge honor to be here. And I know we're talking about the importance of what we do in journalism. I would actually much rather be asked questions, in part because I'm losing my voice, and I had a sick kid. But so I'll talk for a little bit. And I was given a little bit of guidance about what to focus on tonight. As you heard, I cover Donald Trump. I covered his campaign. As best as I can tell, the campaign hasn't ended, even though he's in office. And I covered him for years at the New York tabloids, so I think that's probably why I'm in a bit of a unique position at the moment, despite not being at the tabloids anymore. I understand the sensibility that he's coming from, particularly as it relates to the press. One of my colleagues, Glenn Thrush, whom some of you may have seen parodied on SNL, described him when he and I did a podcast when he was still at Politico a couple of months ago as the page 6 president. And it really is true. I mean, I remember when I was at the New York Post, Trump very often would call page 6 as a source close to Donald Trump and describe things about himself. So that is actually important context for you as you read about him. He is obviously a challenging president to cover. He was a challenging candidate to cover. But he is not particularly unique in the sense that, and we were talking about this over dinner, I subscribe to the theory that very little new exists under the sun. The only thing that's really new is how social media was used by this particular candidate and now president, still used by him. But, I remember Rudy Giuliani as mayor when I was at the New York Post, berating reporters in pretty personal and savage terms. It just didn't, get played on his own newspaper, which is sort of what Trump does. I remember Mike Bloomberg calling a colleague a disgrace at a press conference once. This is not new. It's just the intensity and the repetition and the singularity with which he does it. And one of the things that Trump does do is I think he tests I don't know how many of you are familiar with the movie Broadcast News, which is from the 1980s, and God, do I feel old right now, but but it is a fantastic movie that I would recommend everybody watch. And it was really about sort of the corroding of media by broadcast at that point and how it had been taking place over time. But one character does a piece for the news about date rape, and he includes a cutaway of himself tearing up when the victim is talking. And one of the more noble characters in the movie, who believes in the authenticity of news and the pristine quality of news, was asked what he thought about this piece, and he said, "Yes, let's never forget, we're the real story, not them." And I think that Trump challenges all of us to remember that we are not the story, because he is very good at trying to make you feel like you are a part of the story, or making you a part of the story. I think that for people who are, look, I didn't study journalism in college, so I became a journalist by being a clerk at a New York City tabloid, which was different, I think, probably than what those of you who are doing work with the Crimson do. I would say that we are at a hugely partisan moment right now in media, and people are more self-selective about their media and what they learn than ever before. There is no independent agreement on a set of facts, really. Not none, but it is becoming harder and harder. So, I mean, the importance of keeping skepticism in what you do and about what you're hearing is very important. And who is telling you what they're telling you and why and what their motives are. And if you are doing reporting on a college campus, it is very likely that unless it's a very diverse campus, you're going to be covering people who think a lot like you. And it is going to be very important to try to discover opposing views. I mean, I didn't really have a sense until I left the New York Post how unusual the New York Post was in the media market in New York City, because it's a very conservative paper. And it was not how the Daily News operated when I went there. It was not how Politico operated when I went there. And the only other thing that I would, I think about this a lot, you are all coming of age in journalism at the highest moment of social media that we've experienced. I cannot impress upon you enough the dangers of Twitter. And I know that sounds silly, and I was the person in 2012. I didn't really understand Twitter, and I was railing against it. And gave 2 interviews where I talked about how terrible I thought it was. And I do think that Twitter shrinks everything down to the same size. So if you are getting your news from Twitter, which is what a lot of people do now, and I do too, when you're looking at a newspaper, you can tell, or even watching television, you can tell by the placement, the importance that an outlet is putting behind a story. If something is an investigation, it's a 2-page spread, you know how the paper considers it versus a 6-inch squib. Twitter, everything looks the same. And it's concerning to me in terms of people trying to understand and discern what news is. It's also, it's a terrible way to shape opinion, and it leaves a veneer, and then you find yourself sort of in a swarm of reaction, and you can't really get out of it. And I think it activates all kinds of instincts in people. But I would recommend. I never in a million years would have imagined saying this. I have to read a lot of websites now that I didn't used to focus on particularly. I have to read Breitbart every day because it's a pretty good window into what this president is thinking. I listen to Mark Levin. I listen to Rush Limbaugh. I mean, I've listened to Rush Limbaugh for some time, but sources of information that you might consider questionable or not always particularly accurate, if you are trying to understand the current environment, I would really advocate. And I think I've probably meandered enough now. So if anybody has any questions, happy to answer them.